With me today is Dr. Leon Vanstone. He's a physicist, lecturer, and an expert in RAM and SRAM engine design. He's the CTO of Hypersciences, where he runs a team building hypersonic projectiles. We discuss the perils of space colonization, space travel, equitable math, and the perils of scientific discovery. Without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Leon Vanstone. Today I have with me Dr. Leon Vanstone. He is quite a man to reckon with in conversation.
I'm not sure that's true.
I've had a number of really interesting conversations with him. And my other guest I'd like to introduce is this thing that if you're on audio, you're not going to be able to see this, but it's a very large semi-cylindrical object. Which
doesn't talk much, though, I'm afraid.
No, it does not. So we'll get to this other guest here in a little bit. But I had a number of things I wanted to talk to you about. I think it's funny when I have conversations with you and other people in the same room at the same time, quite often the room gets completely silent and there's a little crowd that kind of builds and it gets bigger and bigger. And people just kind of walk by and they're like, hey, what's going on? And they walk over and then they're just part of the crowd and it just keeps growing. And you really are the center of gravity of a lot of really interesting conversations.
That's because I'm a very big person, clearly.
A lot of mass. So that's actually a very funny joke because your expertise is, among other things, physics and space.
Sure, yeah.
I think that's a fair way to put it. What is your doctorate in?
So my doctorate's in hypersonic aerodynamics, technically speaking, although I did found a rocket lab at the University of Texas, so I do know a little bit of rocket science, at least, you might say. But basically, if it goes really fast and terrifies the US government, it probably has something to do with me, which has not helped the immigration process.
Well, we'll see if we can work on that. I don't think this podcast is going to help very much, but we'll see.
I don't know if I help myself, but still.
No. So why don't we start first by talking about space in general, and then we'll narrow in on kind of your particular field of expertise.
I think sounds great.
Because I think amongst a lot of cultural elites, there is this kind of strange, romantic view that we're going to be able to get off this rock pretty quick. So we can potentially trash this planet because we have a plan B, and that plan B is probably Mars or something else. Well, this is a pretty common.
True. I mean, it is, although, the idea that this planet isn't more fixable than a barren Martian hellscape is perhaps slightly misguided. But sure.
But I think we can agree on that, definitely. But especially because there's just, what are you going to do? Bore into the ground with their boring machine? Because I think that's really is what people are talking about doing. So if that's the goal. And let's go with that premise, because I really think that if we're going to talk through this issue, we need to talk as if we're on the same side as these people who want to colonize. And not to say that that's not also good to do, but putting all your hopes and dreams on that might be might be a bit rough. So first of all, let's talk about space in general. So from my perspective, being mostly a security guy and having a lot of friends who work in the security space, I generally think of it as the fourth domain of war.
Sure. That's one way to think about it.
Cyber being the fifth domain of war. We have sea, air, land, space, which kind of gets a bad rap. A lot of people are like, oh, Space Force, and they kind of...
Right. No, that was quite funny. And it was interesting, really, because you do have to think about the context when, a lot of people they look at NASA and they see this organization. It's very much for the betterment of mankind, which it is. I'm absolutely not saying it's not, but there's sort of this forgetfulness that the Cold War, it was absolutely an arms race, right? And this is why America won the space race. Not like they were the first satellite, nope. First person, nope. First woman, nope. First man, nope. First large vehicle thing, nope. Right? It's sort of like, I know you were a kid, you'd race each other to somewhere and then, the other person would win. So you'd shout, next one to the lamppost wins, and you'd run 10 feet more and in their surprise, they would lose. Imagine I did that, but with Usain Bolt. And the world's, media declares Leon Vanstone, fastest man alive. It wouldn't make any sense. And that's because a race is, of course, the first one to the finish. But you don't win an arms race by being the first one to the finish. You win an arms race by being the last one standing. And that was really what America did, right? It basically said, quietly, not too loudly, but it quietly said, we can put nukes on the moon.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to keep escalating this? And, no small part, supposedly, of the collapse of the Soviet Union was the spending on this space arms race. And so it collapsed, and everybody else was left looking around at each other.
And the nuclear submarines.
They weren't cheap either.
But they were a similar problem, though. If we can launch intercontinental ballistic missiles from a submarine, that's even worse.
Right,
Can't
you can
target
be
that.
anywhere, right?
Yeah.
And I don't need one more black mark against my name. So we won't talk about this. But yeah, so when that happened, and Russia restabilized itself more as what it looks like today, as the collapse of the USSR, and all of this stuff and turmoil, and everyone quietly looked around at each other and said, "So how about we just don't play in space?" Right? And NASA kind of reimagined itself, and it worked with its Russian counterparts very peacefully for a very long time to not weaponize space, because just no one wanted to spend money there, right? And then what you saw, of course, was that more recently the Chinese showed up and they're like, "Hey, we want to play."
Well, I think we missed that whole Star Wars thing. There was definitely a Star Wars program and the Kwajalein missile test range.
Oh, right, yeah,
and
tons of stuff. But then through the 90s and the early noughties, right, NASA kind of quietened down. It becomes this wholly civilian organization. Everyone's like, no, let's just not. Let's just, nuclear arms proliferation comes back, and all these treaties where America and Russia essentially agree to play nicely with each other. And what's been interesting, of course, is that, and it was always a theater of war the whole time, don't get me wrong, it was just we all agreed that we weren't going to be too arms racy about the whole thing, and we would fight on other fronts. But then China shows up, and of course they want to play, and the Chinese astronaut program is military, so NASA said no. The Chinese are like, well, I'm going to build my own space station then. Of course, everyone laughed.
And they did it.
And they did it. I think the first one crashed, I think, from memory, but everyone laughed a bit more. And now there's another one, and now no one's laughing. I mean, they're putting probes on the moon. They're a very capable space nation. And so, of course, China declares they're going to the moon, and, we'll maybe talk about this later, but who knows the legality of that from saying, well, can you put a flag on the moon and say it belongs to you?
We already did that. We're good.
Yeah, right. And so you have this, because then, of course, that, what are you going to do? And China destabilizes all these agreements, and this whole thing collapses. Russia and America are looking at China that isn't held to these, hasn't signed agreements with these other parts to limit itself. And it's like, well, I'm going to put military stuff in space. And as soon as they make that announcement, what happens? You see that the funding for the ISS gets pulled out from under it, because all these other countries are like, well, why am I paying for a share of this space? They all kind of fund it together. They all get the same data. Everyone gets the same tech. It's up to you, kind of thing. China comes and says, we're going to build our own, put all the guns and missiles on it we want, all the weapons tech we want to do. Then you don't get to look at it because this is ours and we built it, and you wouldn't let us play the first time. And every other country's like, well, that's stupid. Now I need a gun space station. And so suddenly the whole thing falls apart. The ISS is being decommissioned or whatever, and everyone's talking about moon bases, and that's the reality of that. And so the Space Force was part of that, right? It always kind of existed as a subset of the Air Force, but now this was this very formal declaration, by Trump, that effectively the U.S. government very seriously considered space to be an active theater of war and would be moving towards that. So
let's talk about the positive side before we get to the sort of the calamities, the war aspect.
There have been so many of late.
I know. So colonization and also just planetary defense. I mean, I think those, not to mention heliospheric, understanding
pesky asteroids, they'll come via,
but also solar flares. There's a lot of danger that it's coming to us eventually. It's a matter of fact.
Right, statistically speaking, it's already happened several times.
It's a matter of fact. It's just a matter of time, maybe well beyond our lifetime, but it will happen. So it makes a lot of sense that we would spend the time and energy to resource an agency or set of agencies that can look outward and plan for that and put up some kind of defense net of some kind to both identify and stop, theoretically thwart it in some way. So I don't think that it's not crazy to think that there would be a huge amount of planetary spending outside of any individual country. So ISS could be that, although I don't think it's got the right kind of sophistication for that purpose. But certainly other things could. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, and it it's a blurry line. And the only difference between the Saturn V and an ICBM, of course, is the astronauts. It's very easy to take things that have everyday use and use them for good or bad, right? I mean, just because many things, for example, aviation flight was an arms race, and now we benefit from an enormously smaller world in terms of planes and technology stuff that was, I'm sure, cybersecurity tools for God knows who is, but probably eventually turns into things that are useful to people like AI and everything else. So I wouldn't, just because it was a weapon or it was it's a theater of war, doesn't mean it doesn't have very legitimate civilian uses. Most military technology does. So, and I agree with you there. Like, you do have to, looking in the long term, it is a matter of time until something fairly catastrophic comes to this planet. It's happened many times before, and it'll happen again. And you would like to be able to do something about that, which would require, a destructive capability in orbit or some kind of shielding capability, or at the very least, very sophisticated sensor equipment, so you can see things coming and decide what you want to do about that. And of course, that's all going to be very interesting, because now what you're sort of saying is, I want a satellite that has some nukes on it. It's not always going to be over me, or it's not going to be, or we all want to put our satellites in the same place. So, or what happens when one nuclear satellite crashes into another and bits of it come back to Earth? That'll be a fun conversation for someone, I'm sure.
I'm sure. And it probably will happen eventually if we put enough nukes up.
Yeah, I mean.
So I kind of want to talk a little bit about the history, the backstory of kind of how we got here, because, I mean, we started with Chinese rockets, 1,000 years ago, where people just shot stuff in the air and they thought it was fun and it was decorative, and then became a warfare thing. And I think the difference between the Bernoulli effect and ramjets and scramjets is actually kind of an interesting story. The way I understand it, the United States government was working very heavily on building the first supersonic vehicles, and they could get them going. Getting them up to speed was not a big issue, but keeping control over them was an enormous problem. And so we spent a bunch of time, a bunch of resources trying to do it, and over, get it just up to speed. It was right there, and then it would just lose control. And then as soon as it dropped below Mach, it would get nice and stable again. And so we went to our UK friends and said, okay, we don't know what's going on. And they're like, well, we do, and we'll trade you VX for it. So we literally traded VX gas for the ability to basically just make our tail fins bigger, bigger plane of surface, and more maneuverable because of that. So I think there is an arms race, but there's also this interesting collaborative effect that comes when you're dealing with these types of military, this cutting edge military stuff. I think Scram and Ram are the next big thing that is very similar to that. Would you do a kind of a brief primer just so people understand both, kind of Bernoulli effect and then also what Ram and Scram are?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, at the crux of it, your easiest way to go really, really fast is to have a rocket engine. But they are the pretty much least efficient of any engine you could use. And this means for any given size of vehicle or amount of fuel, you're always at a disadvantage to a more sophisticated engine. But they are, of course, very special in the sense that, rockets do not require air to fly, right? They're entirely self-contained.
It's quite useful in space.
Yeah, getting up to very high speeds. And they're a bit of a brute force approach in many senses. But what is exactly as you said, when you don't understand the conditions you're flying at, when you don't really understand the physics of what you're doing, but you want to do it anyway, rockets are a great start. But at some point you say, okay, you've built the steam engine. You don't know thermodynamics, but you built the steam engine. But wouldn't it be lovely if we could get to the internal combustion engine, right? So you then say, well, I want to have a more sophisticated engine. And especially if you're flying inside the atmosphere, which already has oxygen in it, a large rocket,
it brings its own oxygen with it.
Right. It's packed inside, which is it's a real pain, right? That's a large rocket. 1,000-ton rocket would be 400. 1,000-ton rocket would have 400 tons of oxygen inside it, liquid oxygen, right? And for reference, that's pretty much the weight of the ISS. So a decent-sized rocket taking off basically carries the ISS. And that could be cargo capacity, but it's not. It's oxidizer instead. So if you can just take it from the air, that's what your car does. No one puts oxygen in their car, right? You put gasoline in it, and it pulls it from the air. So you can just get a much more efficient engine. You can do more, et cetera, et cetera. So, and anyone that's building those kind of engines will always have an advantage. So that's where we all want to go. So you say, okay, let's think of a standard transatlantic airplane, one with the big fan engines on the front, right? Well, those are actually just jet engines. And then they, instead of producing lots of thrust, they have a spindle and they stick the big fan on because it's a more efficient way of using them. And you say, okay, well, what if I want to go quicker than that? Well, at some point, the jet that comes out the back of the engine does need to be moving quicker than the vehicle to give it a good push. If you want a good efficient engine, right? So at some point you're just going too fast that you can't blow air out the back. So you say, okay, I'm going to take the big fan off it. I'm going to go with just a jet engine.
Let's do Bernoulli first.
Right. So the Bernoulli, I mean,
the way I understand it is there's still some confusion about whether Bernoulli effect pushes a wing from the bottom or pulls it from the top. Or maybe it's a net effect that happens on both sides of the wing that basically causes lift.
Right. So, and the difference there, I suppose, is the engine on an airplane is the wing. So that's what makes it fly, right? All the engines do on the front is kind of pull it forward, and you could use a rocket, you could use whatever, but it's the wing that makes it fly. Whereas with a rocket, it's the actual engine that flies the vehicle. And the Bernoulli's effect is a mathematical equation which essentially describes for relatively low speed aerodynamics. So if you go too quick, the model breaks and you have to do, we understand it enough, but you have to do something else. So Bernoulli's equation basically says that there is this concept of thing called total pressure. So the total pressure around a vehicle might be the same, but depending on the velocity of something over the top, over a certain area, the static pressure will change. And so one of the ways that a wing is often described as functioning is that it accelerates air over the top of it and less so under the bottom of it. And so what that does is it drops the pressure on top of the wing statically and lifts the whole wing up that way. Now, the trouble is it gets kind of confusing because that's a tool. That's a mathematical tool used to describe things. Very, very useful. But at some point it always breaks down and it's maths. So maths, what makes it so versatile about math is that it doesn't matter if I'm talking about toasters, pennies, plants. If the model works, it works, right? So, but it has no physical meaning. It's not in and of itself meaningful. Mm-hmm. It's a model. It's a model to model something that's going on around you so that you can use it and design it, whatever. All a wing really does is push air down. And pushing air down, by Newton, good old boy, apples and all that, is push you up, right? It's the same thing. If you've ever held a medicine ball and thrown it at the ground, right? You lift up. If you're on an office chair and you wiggle, it moves too, right? Equal and opposite force. So a wing flies a plane by pushing air down and pushing the plane up.
Okay, now let's get to ram and scram.
All right, so as I was saying a bit earlier about the engines, right? So as you go faster and faster and faster, the way the engine works needs to change because you design the engine for what it does, right? So the big fan engine on a commercial transatlantic jet is designed for about Mach 1. That's what they do. If you want to go quicker than that, you take the big fan off and you just use the actual engine in the middle of it. It's basically a jet engine. That does you pretty well. At some point, though, you're flying so fast that you start just compressing air in front of you. So on an engine, you think of a normal cycle. You've got a compression stage, you have a combustion stage, and then you have a turbine. And the turbine is used to drive the compressor normally, and then any energy that's left over is you use to go forward. As you go faster and faster, you start shoving yourself into the air. And, if I took a cup, I can scoop water out of a flat basin or a tank of water, even though gravity would want to make it run out because I can scoop through, right? Mm-hmm. And you can tell engineers were sophisticated when they came out with this because it's called a ramjet. And the way it works is by ramming air down it. So there's no compression stage on it anymore in terms of all these, fans or anything.
No fans.
Yeah. Nothing like that. They don't work. They break, right?
Is that a material problem or is it a performance that they just can't turn fast enough? Or
it's the blades don't like. They end up off condition and they basically start to stall or they start to flutter and they tend to break and fall through the engine and large, delicate, fast spinning things don't like debris moving through them. And so what you do is you go to a ram engine, and a ram engine is quite interesting in some senses. It's a very simple thing. It often looks like a tube, right? And then the smartness of it is all in understanding the physics of what's going on, right? You have to, or it just will not work. So you have a tube, the air goes in it, you have a constriction, and the air is forced to move through it just by the sheer kinetic force of all the gas coming in behind it. And it compresses down, you inject some fuel, and you burn it. And you burn it, very important, it's what makes a ramjet a ramjet. you burn it subsonically. So where the bit where you do combustion is not moving very fast.
And that's because it puts out the flame?
I mean, yeah, it's like trying to light a candle in a, with a leaf blower going. It's just, we as humans have spent all our time getting combustion to work at low speeds. And we were good at that, right? And so we stuck to it. Why fight those battles? Why make life harder, But the problem you have, so let's say this. Let's say let's say I'm burning gasoline in my ramjet, right? And the combustion temperature of gasoline, and I'm just making numbers up.
You wouldn't use gasoline.
No, you wouldn't. But again, I don't. There are things I don't want to talk about publicly. So, but let's just say I was using gasoline. It's just something people are familiar with, right? And let's pretend the combustion temperature of gasoline, as I'm just making this up, is 1,500 Fahrenheit, right? So as I go faster and faster, as I compress the gas more and more and bring it to a stop in the middle of my engine, or, sort of as I suck all this gas into this engine and slow it down really quickly to burn it and spit it out the back, right? Whichever way you want to think about that. As I do that, it gets hot because compressing gases, the perfect gas equation says, and just, you ever pumped up a football with a football pump, and your bike, and you go to pull the end off, it gets hot. Compressed gas is hot, and that's good. You actually want that to an extent. But what do you do when the temperature of that compressed gas exceeds the combustion temperature of your fuel? What if my gas is at 2,000 Fahrenheit, and then when I've burned my fuel in it, it's at 1,800?
Doesn't it just solve your problem? Now you don't have to worry about the leaf blower problem?
Well, now it's cooling down. I'm cooling down my flow. I have to put heat in to get useful work done. And I'm burning a fuel. I have a fuel that burns at 1,500 Fahrenheit in a flow that's at 2,000 Fahrenheit. So what I'm doing is I'm cooling down I'm taking energy out. I'm not putting it in, right? And you end up, it's like you have terminal velocity, right? It's like a terminal temperature, all right? Where you go, as you fly faster and faster and faster, the gas is so hot in your engines subsonically that it just gets it just becomes complete. You get less and less and less thrust, even if you could keep dumping more and more fuel in and manage the heat, because it's trying to melt everything, which is a real bummer. No one likes melty engines, and you have to deal with all of that. But even if you could, you just physics say, a heat engine, its efficiency goes to nothing, and you get stuck. Basically, you can't fly any faster.
And what speed is this typically happening?
It depends. It certainly depends where you are in the atmosphere. But as a Mach number, which is typically given as a relative to the speed of sound, you're talking about somewhere between Mach 3 and Mach 5, depending what you've done and what you think. But yeah, I mean, you're talking about like 1,000 meters a second kind of thing. You're flying at like.
That's going pretty fast still.
Yeah, you're pretty. That's a spicy.
Yeah.
Spicy, right?
Yeah.
And then, so then what you say is okay, well, now I can't be subsonic in my engine anymore. I can't afford it because I get stuck. Even if I could deal with the heat and the inefficiency and everything else, I stop accelerating at some point. So you say, okay, I have to be supersonic combustion now. And again, comes in the brilliant naming convention of these imaginative engineers. Why is it called a ram engine? Because I ram air into it. And you're like, okay, why is it called a scram engine? Because I supersonically combust it in my ram, and I ram air into it. And you're like, all right, I see where we're going with this one, boys. Like, so yeah, and that's basically the only difference. And, it's sort of like, I don't know, it seems a bit trivial, or it seems like a small trivial difference, but again, having that stay working, they have this teensy little problem where they explode, and that doesn't end very well because the thing
why would that matter?
Well, typically, if you blow the engine out, or it's actually called unstart. So scramjet engines are prone to a phenomenon called unstart, where basically think of it like a funnel. I'm pouring water in a funnel, right? But I'm doing so at like 2,000 miles an hour. Right, and the water does not flow consistently. And if my funnel empties at any point, if I don't put enough water in it, it goes out.
And why would that happen? You just hit a pocket of low pressure or something?
Or you pitch up, you pitch down. As your vehicle flies around or whatever.
That seems like a useful thing to be able to do.
Yeah, it would be real useful. Or even, you go high and low pressure. When you fly at those, you think turbulence on a plane is bad. Wait until you do that 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times faster, right? Like you hit these pockets and they're coming at you much quicker. They're harder to see.
Like clouds, I'm sure, have interesting effects.
All kind, yeah, God, like rain at 5,000 miles an hour. That's a bullet. Hail is definitely like these are problems. I mean, these are real problems if you want to fly these vehicles. And
wouldn't the solution to that typically be just fly higher?
Yeah, you can, but you just have atmospheric variation still. You still have higher and lower pressure areas and all this. You'll never be perfectly smooth, right? Is my point, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And so you're filling this funnel with this varying thing at thousands of miles an hour, trying to do all kinds of stuff. You know, you pitch up, pitch down, whatever. You know, and if it empties, all your thrust disappears, and you massively decelerate. Mm-hmm. And if it overflows, which is the worst case, if you're very, very lucky, it'll overflow and violently pitch the vehicle. And then, because you're now doing, you know, like put your hand outside a car in a moving vehicle, you can fly your hand, right? You're not even going at 70 miles an hour, and that's enough force just from the air to lift your hand up and down. If you're doing, you know, thousands of miles an hour, it'll just disintegrate the vehicle.
I thought you meant your hand. Yeah,
well,
that too.
Well, that too. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge, and that's what hampers scramjet engines. And as with most things, you need the engine before you can have the plane, right? You know, like the Wright brothers had a propeller. They knew about that technology. They flew their plane with one on it, and that powered it as they flew. When they were trying to do the supersonic stuff, they had an engine capable of accelerating the vehicle. It was just they were trying to figure out the vehicle, and it's this same problem. You need the engine really before it becomes cheap enough to fly something repeatedly, and then figure out the rest of the physics, which are also really tricky. And that's kind of the problem that we're at now, is if you can crack that egg. Now that, you know, I mean, some people have gone ahead anyway, and there are definitely people doing hypersonic flight vehicles with launching them off rockets and things like this. And so, and I won't speak too deeply into that, but that's kind of where we're at, and why we care about them and why they're relevant, because it's all about a hypersonic vehicle and what you can do with that.
So Leon, I know you like talking, but we're gonna have to let our other guest into this conversation.
So get a word in.
Yes. So this is a hypersonic bullet, for lack of a better term. Is that how you describe it?
I wouldn't sanction that.
Okay. Well, what word should we use for this? For the purpose of this?
Yes, essentially.
Okay. Yes, essentially.
That's not official branding.
No. Okay. What would you call this? So
this would be a vehicle.
This is a vehicle.
It can be, okay. Or maybe a payload, I suppose. And it is something that you know, I'm Hypersciences, the company I'm CTO for, is we have an engine that functions in many of the similar principles that we just talked about RAM engines and scramjets and so forth, that enables us to accelerate something like this to very high speeds, similar to a company called Spinlaunch, say, which has this kinetic kind of launch.
Let's get to Spinlaunch in a bit. I just want to talk about the utility of this vehicle first, and then we can jump there.
For want of a better word, it is a chemical-powered railgun that suffers very few of the disadvantages associated with the railgun. So I can repeatedly and cheaply accelerate something. This is a 10-kilogram projectile, but it works on the same principles as the RAM engines on the SR-71. So it scales to much larger masses. It scales to much higher diameters. But we have fired one of these or launched.
Just for the audience's sake, this is shaped very much like a bullet. It's very tapered, very long, cylindrical for the most part. And part of the key aspect of this is it has a compression phase where it slowly compresses the fuel air mixture down, and then combusts it and pushes. So as it's traveling through the tube, call it the outside of the engine, it gets faster and faster and faster until it breaks free and becomes a projectile.
Right. And I suppose that is the fundamental difference between what we're doing and a gun, right? A gun is not an engine. A gun applies all of its force onto that bullet pretty much at the beginning. That's when you generate all of the energy, right?
As soon as the powder's done, its powder's done.
Right, exactly. And then you've got some enthalpy reservoir. You never generate any. There's a certain amount of energy, a pocket of energy, and you just harvest as much energy from that as you can and go, right? Which is the sort of the equivalent of saying, I want to push a football, right? I can walk up to it and roll the football, sure, or I can just kick it, right? And that works quite well at moving a football. What if I want to move a truck, right? If I take a running kick at that truck, is it going to budge even an inch? Like, unlikely. If all I'm going to do is break my foot.
You haven't seen me kick.
Yeah, well, maybe. Right? But all I will do is break my foot because at some point, the amount of energy you're trying to put into something approaches the limit of what you can structurally build. And that's what you see. The guns only get so big before they just explode, right? So what you'd rather do then, I mean, okay, maybe not a truck, but I can push a car, right? If I gave a car a kick, it wouldn't move, but I can push it. Mm-hmm. And so if you have an engine, something that constantly applies force over a distance, you can keep accelerating something to much higher velocities than you used to. And this is the concept of the RAM accelerator, which is the underpinning technology that our company is looking to commercialize. And what it allows you to do is take very large masses in comparison, that you would never see a gun would ever scale to, and accelerate them to very high velocities. So Mach 5, which is about 1.5 kilometers a second. So what is that for you imperialists? About a mile a second, right? Give or take. So what's useful there is, or as you described it, right? The principle of this engine is that you take a tube, you pre-fill it with gas, fuel and oxidizer mixed together, and the tube is constant. It's kind of like extending the cowling on the SR-71, and through it, then you accelerate this geometry. And the trick here, the clever bit, is in understanding the physics well enough to do this. And as this whizzes through, it will compress as it moves through. The cow would only be just a bit wider than the body. It will compress the gas around it, and then if you tweak your physics just right, you can get it to ignite, and it will stabilize as a subsonic combustion region on the rear of this projectile. So it looks like a rocket plume. It looks like this is actually a rocket in a tube. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of similar to what Elon Musk is doing, right? He's trying to re-land first stage rockets, for instance, right? But if that's my first stage, is this tube, right? And if that stays on the ground and it can be big and heavy, I don't have to re-land anything I never fly. And so in one of the applications would be to throw second stage vehicles through this thing and just ballistically launch them to some altitude, and then have a small insertion stage come in to move cargo to orbit. But you can also do other things. You can, it's a low cost mass accelerator. So actually, one of the somewhat surprising applications for this technology is drilling and tunneling. Rotary
and
mining, any kind of resource extraction, because the way we currently mine hard rock is you just rub it really aggressively with much enthusiasm, basically, right? Like if you look at a drill bit, it's just a stubby head, and all you do is you just grind it into the ground with a lot of weight, and you just let it turns hard rocks literally into sand. That's what it does. And unsurprisingly, that rubbing something aggressively is not a very efficient way of breaking it. It's like, how long would you have to rub two bricks together before they were nothing but powder? But a hammer, on the other hand, it's a much more efficient way of doing it. So you can just meteor these things into the ground, and you can actually very efficiently tunnel with them. Their applications
and you can do it over and over and over and over again.
Right? Yeah.
You don't have to make every one of these out of well milled aluminum.
Right. I mean, yeah. This is a bit more sophisticated. This is something more like an aerospace. We flew this. It was an aerospace demonstrator, but yeah, you can make them the geometry is the smart bit, right? Not the insides of it. So I can pour these out of concrete. I can pour them out of plastic. I mean, as long as it will survive the environment it's in, I can make it out of that. So, and that's what's nice about it, is you can injection mold them out of plastic if you want to, and accelerate these things up to very high velocities, and then smash them into something. And that has a very legitimate civilian applications, which is primarily what we're interested in.
So oil exploration, mining exploration, geothermal.
Geothermal is actually a really big one. Your ability to dig very deep, large holes through very hard rock. Another one that's really useful is resource extraction. Another one that's got a lot of application is just subterranean infrastructure. Like it is hard to break rock, so people typically don't do it. Hey, we know we're in Austin, Texas. How many people have basements here? Very few, because the very thin topsoil, it goes straight down to something substantially harder. So it's not worth doing. And so all of these things become considerably more doable and cheaper than they were before. And in that sense, it's this very enabling technology. It's really a hypersonic platform. It's what technology is, what we're working towards. And that's what we're interested in, especially you touched on mineral extraction, but rare earth metals. The moment the way you mine rare earth metals is you find somewhere that's got a lot in the soil. You scrape all the soil off the side of a mountain. You process the soil to get them out. Maybe you do it and put it back. And there's plenty of rare earths in hard rocks, just a pain to get them out. Because it's not like they exist as an actual metal or a vein of it, really. It's just kind of vaguely mixed in. And it's so hard to get the rocket, it's not worth processing. But this would potentially enable America or many countries as well, to really remove this stranglehold that China has on rare earths, which in my mind would be a great thing.
Yeah, definitely. So, or certainly it could be. So one other thing I think you didn't talk about is different types of material sciences. So normally if you take a Mach 5 vehicle and you slam it into a piece of rock or something, there's no difference between slamming it into a piece of rock and slamming it into another Mach 5 vehicle hitting right at it, except for there is no rock on Earth that could possibly stop the kinetic energy of a Mach 5 vehicle. It just turns it into dust, right? So therefore, there is some benefit of slapping the two of these things together from a material science perspective. Like you can create totally brand new types of material, whatever it is, to a liquid and a solid that would normally never go together would suddenly be forced to turn into something. And liquids, from our perspective, are something that's stable at our temperatures, but you can turn something very solid into a liquid very quickly.
Yeah, no, that's very true. So you can have some interesting metamaterial applications with this technology by basically slapping two of them into each other at like ridiculous speeds. And what that does is force some very interesting phases of matter, or just rather unusual combinations of things that would never happen normally at the surface or happen rarely. You think of it as like kinetic quenching. If I take a sword and I heat it up, and you see this, in blacksmithing, they dump it into the bucket and all the steam comes off. It makes the metal stronger, because when it's hot, the metal is actually in a better phase that you like, and then you quench it to freeze it in that, right? And it's sort of the same thing. You slap these two things together, and it's also fast that this enormous force is applied that causes something interesting to happen, and then it's over so quickly that it kind of gets stuck in a state it would never naturally be in. And then you can come and hoover up the dust, and that has some very interesting applications too. Yes, that you're not wrong. And there are a lot of applications we just haven't looked at because we don't have this engine that enables us to quickly accelerate to hypersonic speeds. And we do. It's a rocket. They're expensive. It's $2 to $5 million a pop. So you keep them in your back pocket for bigger stuff. But we're more interested in these kind of commercial use cases where you're saying, well, what if I could throw something to orbit every 30 seconds, or what if I could make some really exotic state of matter.
And what are the general costs to launch comparatively between these different platforms? Like if I want to launch a 100-kilogram object into space using a chemical rocket or this, what would be the delta?
I mean, on a chemical rocket would be orders of magnitude cheaper.
Cheaper?
Oh, we are cheaper by orders of magnitude. I mean, if I want to just accelerate something small, like launching this, throwing this to the Von Karman line or something.
10 kilograms.
10 kilograms. Yeah, it's about, how long is that? About a meter long, meter and a bit, right? Accelerating, getting that up there, you're talking about a couple $1,000s or something. And I mean, and that's it's not a raw cost to me. That's like with people involved and supply lines and like logistics,
So you could even get it down further if you had a supply chain if people want to do this all the time.
Yeah, right. I mean, of course you could scale anything. I mean, it's like, here's a good analogy. What does it cost to launch a rocket? I don't know. It's about 100 mil. Depends if it's used or not, right? But you say people assume that going to space is expensive because the rocket is expensive, but a Boeing or an Airbus plane, They're hundreds of millions of dollars for the plane. The difference is how many times it flies and all of the ecosystem you've built around airports and getting fuel there and everything else. The logistics of bringing the price down there are baked into that. And that's going to be a difficulty, I think, with terrestrial rocket launching. It's that just having that scale on it, getting it down to that cost is going to be hard. And I really hope that, I mean, that's great. A rising tide raises all ships. I really hope Elon and Jeff and everyone else can make good on their promises, because that would be fantastic. I'd love to see. My stretch goal in life is to die by Jupiter, but
we'll get to that.
Yeah, why go to Mars? You can die all the way out of Jupiter.
We'll talk about death at the end, I guess. So why don't we? I think when I think of this, I think of sort of these terror weapons from World War II and Iraqi Project Babylon and these super guns. Why isn't that the answer? I mean, why can't I just say, throw a bunch of gunpowder at the end of this thing or whatever explosive and just launch it over, 100 miles? Because they have gotten these guns well over 100 miles now, and I don't see a particularly huge reason other than the cost and the inflexibility of moving the guns around why they can't scale that.
Yeah, there's a few things that just make it a real pain. One of the biggest ones, outside of the sheer logistical nature of this thing, is, and it's a bit like a rocket engine. Using it, you're so close. A gun of that size is so close to blowing itself up. It's almost a coin toss, just like a rocket. That is a vehicle so close to the material science, the edges of our understanding of everything, that even tiny little changes can cause it just to blow up, right? And the same with a gun of that size. It's so stressful just to do it once, that the idea that you do it 20, 50, 100 times, and like, it's not, I could do 100, I might do 100 launches in a day. That'd be no problem for the kinds of, for the RAM accelerator, right? Because it doesn't fire impulsively. But for a gun, doing it once is doable. Doing it many times, it's gonna blow up quite catastrophically. So that's one piece that's a problem. The second piece is, if you wanted it to actually be large, like if you want a lot, like a 1-ton vehicle, right? This is a baby toy in terms of what I would consider a space vehicle, right? But in terms of a artillery round, this is quite large and heavy. Mm-hmm. They don't throw things like, it's hard for modern weaponry to throw things like this. There's few exceptions. So if you want to launch an actual vehicle or anything of any reasonable size, and again, look at what Spinlaunch is doing, those kind of, a couple feet wide, 10 foot, 20 foot long sort of thing. A gun would really struggle there. And then the flip side of that is, because you're doing it so impulsively, the G loading on the vehicle is insane. You're talking about 10,000 Gs, 20,000 Gs. And for context, 1,000 Gs is the sort of force that you would see if you took the cover off your phone and dropped it on the floor, like a concrete floor. That's 1,000 Gs. Packaged electronics will survive that quite well. I had a solid state hard drive that said, warranty void if product is wetted, more than 1,500 Gs, 1,500 Gs, or if I pulled the sticker off. That pesky sticker really does always get you. But I took it apart anyway. Had to be done. But like that, that's fine. You can drop things. That's okay. That's 1,000 Gs. That's pretty survivable packaged electronics. But when you start getting to 10,000, 20,000 Gs, the idea that anything would survive that, at 20,000 Gs, a 1 gram component, a resistor, an LED, effectively weighs 20,000 times more. So I've got some tiny little resistor with 2 little legs that hold it into a circuit board. And I won't embarrass myself by trying to do the math, but what is that? Like 20 suddenly weighs 20 kilograms, right? And boom, it's pulling on the circuit board, and they want to rip out, stuff wants to come off. And, and that 400 kilograms or 400 tons of oxygen I told you about earlier on a large rocket suddenly becomes 20,000 times heavier, and just that stuff starts to break and everything else. So it really becomes incompatible there.
Yes. And also, I think from a defensive perspective, if you want to have something like this, you definitely don't want to keep it in one spot.
Right.
So if I'm thinking of the V2 supergun or or that, I guess it wasn't V2. It was
V3, I think, was the distributed combustion gun. Yeah.
And the Project Babylon. I think those are very dangerous because they're just sitting there in one spot. They're very heavy. They're big infrastructure. You can't really move them on a rail. They're just stuck. That's where they're going to be. And I think from a defensive perspective, if you have to move the thing around, or you want to move the thing around, like, our insertion point into space would be better if we were over here. Like this, you could probably throw and pack on the back of a truck and move it around. And
Sure. I mean, even from a civilian point of view, I mean, like look at all the schedule delays caused by hurricanes off of Florida because you can't move Cape Canaveral, right?
Yeah.
And so it's some hurricane rolls through and suddenly everyone's schedules bump back by 9 months, and you're just like, oh God. And so the ability to have
this could right through a hurricane.
Right. Oh yeah. If I launched one of these in a hurricane, what I would get is a hurricane with a hole in it. Right? When you're doing thousands of miles an hour, the idea that the first 3 seconds of your journey has a slightly sideways wind velocity in comparison to you means nothing. You know. Poof.
Right. But which is interesting because in a ramjet or scramjet, it would have catastrophic effects in large.
Yeah, that would be sad. That'd be a bad day for you.
So it's interesting that it's really the stuff around the center mass that is the problem with those engines, the engine design.
They're very sophisticated, and that very first bit of atmosphere that we so lovingly live in, that's relatively thick and soupy and has all this rain and stuff and movement in it. It's a problem if you want to do something sophisticated in it. And again, another advantage of something like a kinetic launch for your first stage is that it takes a lot of that. It's a very repeatable, predictable method of doing so. We understand ballistics very well. You know, if you throw something up, where does it go? Where does it come down? So it does make it very robust. Yes, it's an appealing piece.
So let's talk about rockets now, because I think rockets are really great for exactly one thing, and really just one thing compared to this. Getting people up into space, because I find it difficult to believe you're going to be able to build something where you can fit a human in this and create a tube long enough that it's going to be comfortable for anyone, let alone a Jeff Bezos and his merry crew kind of situation.
I mean, it could definitely be done. The problem you run into is you say, if I want to accelerate someone to a speed, right, or take that speed. And if you want to limit them at a G, you can do the math quite quickly on how long it has to be. So, I mean, probably maximum comfortable G that could be sustained for short periods of time. I mean, like less than 20 seconds. It's maybe 20 G.
That's a lot.
Eyeballs in. You don't like someone too much, it could be done, right? You'd be fine. People, I mean, like a 70 mile an hour, like dead stop into a wall car wreck is like 100, 150 G, right? And there are people who have survived those sorts of things.
Yeah, but the next day they're not feeling
they
it.
Ain't great. No, yeah. I would much rather be on the rocket, right? So, but like a 10G track, if you wanted to do this for a human, which I wouldn't say is perhaps necessarily the first thing you would go to. This for me is amazing cargo applications, but we can elaborate more on that bit. But you could easily have a 20 kilometer tube with a 1.5 meter vehicle in it, weighs a couple tons that would carry a few people and put them in orbit.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, one of the things I think this has very useful applications for is non-squishy, contents. Here's an example. I mean, I know this isn't cutting edge, but it still illustrates the point. The maximum crew capacity of the ISS is about 10 astronauts, give or take, right? Varies. The weight of the ISS is 400 tons. Now, what that would imply is that for every astronaut, for every single person, I need 40 tons of stuff, right? So for every 100 kilograms of astronaut, I need 40 tons of metal and stuff and equipment. And okay, you can probably do a bit better than that if you wanted to be leaner. And if you're not staying there very long, it can be less. But if you want to live in space, which we were saying is the dream, is colonization, we have these stations, stuff on the moon. I need that amount of stuff to support every living, breathing thing. And just for short periods of time, not like decades, but just like more than a few days, basically, right? So sure, you take a starship, whatever, it's got 100-ton capacity, whatever it is, right? And you fill it full of people, and now, if each person's 100 kilograms, I've got 1,000 people in space. That's great. But what's 1,000 times 40 tons, right? Mm-hmm. I need 40,000 tons of stuff now to keep 1,000 people alive. On that rough math. And
right.
These systems don't always extrapolate like that. But my point being, for every human you put up there, you're going to need a lot of metal, a lot of it, right? In fact, if if I built a 100-ton station, if I extrapolate from the ISS, I can put 2.5 people in it, right? Which, okay, there's no such thing. So I can put 2 people in it. So one Starship will carry enough stuff for 2 astronauts, or, you know, would carry a spaceship with 2 astronauts in it that could live up in space. That's it. That's all you can do. So even if it launches 10,000 times, I've still only put 20,000 people in space. And like that 30,000 people fly on a plane, you know, like that, right? That's millions of people fly every hour or day or whatever. So, you know, well, in fact, I think it's about 36,000 airplanes take off in the US every day, right? And it's 800 people, whatever, 500 people each one. So it gives you this impression then that if you are talking about moving away from a world that's a onesie twosies and getting to a thing where it's an everyday thing, and it's not like all of humanity even gets to fly in a plane, right? It's just like the top 10, 20%.
So what are you picturing? What kind of cargo is most critical for getting people to Mars? What do they need? Water, food, the equipment to sort of manage their air supply.
It depends on your vision.
Shielding, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it depends on your vision of how you think you do this. You know, there are those that want to go to Mars as quickly as possible. Okay, if you want to do that, you need a station or some kind of ship, right? You're going to have to make it either on Earth or in orbit of Earth. And there are some people looking at that. How do you produce, you know, because things can't be big in a rocket because they've got to go in the rocket, right? But
as
then
wide as 2 horses' butts,
right? Exactly.
That's
Yeah,
the old
I know.
Story.
And yeah, ask us for that one later. But so
or just look it up. You can find it.
And yeah, so you it has to package into a rocket, or maybe you can launch raw materials and you can do that in space. You can 3D print your vehicle in space, right? But you're gonna need all kinds of things. You need water, you need supplies, you need food, you need shielding, you need a vehicle, right? And those things aren't thick. They're basically Coke cans, right? The aluminium shell on the ISS is really thin. You need all that stuff.
But it's got to have quite a bit of shielding, right? So what do they use for shielding?
You can do a few things. You can either have certain areas that you don't spend a lot of time in and you only shield local areas. You can put water. You can pump the water on the outside of the vehicle or store it as ice on the outside as sort of a protective shell. Water actually makes quite a good shield. You can say you don't care, honestly, and, you know, let the astronauts aren't going to die. But they're definitely probably getting cancer.
So what's the difference between setting something up that's heavy versus something that's light with a design like this? So let's say I fill it entirely with lead shot or something and say...
I mean, makes no difference to me. The heavier it gets, the easier it is to get up there.
Really?
Well, into some sense, yeah, because I've got to punch through the atmosphere. So being small and heavy helps me there. And it only makes my engine a little longer from my perspective. But yeah, I mean, you could absolutely move. This is an ideal package for moving large, heavy things into orbit.
And then the idea is you have a very small booster stage at the bottom to take it from low Earth orbit to the next.
Right. It's exactly like a Spinlaunch or any of these kinetic launch concepts where we basically accelerate a second stage.
You really want to talk about Spinlaunch today. All right, let's just do that.
Oh, let people look it up.
No. I think it's interesting. So for those who aren't aware what it is, it basically is kind of like a David and Goliath slingshot. It goes faster and faster and faster, and when it and all of a sudden it hits that exact perfect apex, and
angle,
then and then releases, and it goes straight up.
Right, it's a giant spinny arm. Yeah,
spinny arm.
With which, you know, imagine you ever done that like windmill thing as a kid where you put water in a bucket and then span it around really fast, and the water stays in the bucket as it goes over your head, and then imagine you did that up to about 2 kilometers a second, and then you let go of the bucket and it just whooshes off and up. I mean, that's the concept.
That's the idea.
That's the idea, right?
But from what I can tell, that they only have a very small demonstrator.
I mean, well, this is sort of the one of the, take it with a pinch of salt, of course. The CTO of one company believes their technology is better than another, but still, I genuinely do. And they have a spinny arm that's about the size of the Statue of Liberty currently, and it's a 1/3 scale demonstrator. And they're using it to throw. They threw something down they sort of looked a bit like this. It was larger, although they didn't say how high it went. So, that always kind of, who knows what happened there. But Yeah, they threw that, and then it takes hours for them to spin it up. If you have to really make sure you let go of it at just the right time, or that's a bad day for everyone. And then the idea is they would throw a second stage. Their G is also higher than ours is, as best we can figure it out anyway.
Well,
and it's sustained.
Also, there's a sideways G.
Right, it's spinning, so it's kind of crushing, and there are some things you can do to mitigate it. But yeah, we think they have higher G for longer periods. Which is less agreeable to your vehicle.
Well, and also the way that you'd fix that is you'd point it away from yourself, right? So it would have sort of the effect of always accelerating towards the center as you spinning it around or something, right? Is that your idea?
Yeah. Well, you have to support it now. So it has to be some kind of cradle on this giant arm thing. You just have to. It's a mess. I don't know. I mean, and also I'm just guessing what they're doing. I haven't spent too long studying it. But.
So. The major reason I'm not a super big fan of that design is, first of all, it's enormous. Like, as you said, a third the size, or
a 1/3 scale demonstrator is the size of the Statue of Liberty. It's not like you can put this thing. You're gonna struggle to move this,
right?
It's enormous.
And if I wanted to put this somewhere that's difficult to get to, like the moon or something,
yeah, it's a lot of research.
That seems like you'd need your technology just to build their technology.
Yeah, you would have to, the nice one. Well, there's a couple of one thing I like about this is you can tunnel and fly with it. So if you were on the moon with one of our tunneling versions of this, not only could you dig your moon base, you could then turn around and use it to throw satellites out into the cosmos for almost zero cost. Because again, you keep the engine and only the payload gets thrown, right? Which unlike today, even with a conventional rocket, you end up with a lot of debris that's just spent stages going round and round that just become hazards for everyone else. I mean, there's also just a cadence, right? I mean, the Spinlaunch is enormous, has to spin up. It takes them hours, if not a good chunk of the day to get that thing up to speed. I could reasonably fire something like this off every couple minutes without even trying too hard. You end up asking yourself, well, how quickly can I really move these around and reload the system? That becomes my problem, as opposed to this enormous spinning arm that then has to spin up and come to velocity and then spin back down.
And spin back down, right?
I mean, and I will say credit to the Spinlaunch guys, though. I mean, I do like what they're doing. They're still saying, a rocket launches once every 3 months or something, right? Or once every month. You get a pad, you get the vehicle on it, you do your inspections, you launch it, and then it comes back and blah, 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 right? They're still talking about just a complete change in cadence from I launch once a month to I launch every day, right? Which is, it's good work. And I do like,
Well, that's not going to work for you.
Well, I mean, I'd rather launch every, I mean, one plane doesn't take off from an airport every day. They queue them up behind each other and it's 2 minutes ago. And again, if you want to move to that kind of a world, which I do, we have to, because I do believe that space exploration is important. If you want to move to that,
why is it important, Leon?
Well, it's a great many reasons. I mean, one, it's just an area you will develop technology. People talk about this. They say, well, why should we go? It'd be funding space technology. Shouldn't we be focusing on technology here on Earth? And you're like, how do you think we went to space? We didn't only develop space technology to go to space. We used terrestrial technology.
We also used it to threaten Russians.
Indeed. You could do that with a saber, I mean, or an offensive flag. But, and so the technology that's developed in space is not limited somehow magically to space. Here's an example. When the Hubble telescope, when the lenses on them weren't great, they while they were trying to figure out how to fix it, a bunch of scientists, physicists decided to figure out if they could take something that was blurry and make it sharper with some math. And the answer is that you can. And they used that for a while until they fixed it. But that technology ultimately found use in MRI machines. So it's used in image processing now, where you have blurry images that should be sharper to tighten them back up. And you see a whole host of terrestrial technologies that see their use in space, and space technologies that see their use on terrestrial applications. Like, science doesn't work like that. Science doesn't care. Math doesn't care whether something your understanding came from space, from the ground. At the end of the day, it's just a tool for you to use and build that out. And that's a sort of, and even more broadly, perhaps, also, there's just effectively infinite resource in our solar system. And if we could harness it, you're talking about a world where no one would need to be hungry, no one would need to go without, where there's infinite space, infinite resources, all of this sort of silly squabbling just goes away and people can get on with things. And maybe I watched a bit too much Star Trek as a kid.
Say, that sounds an awful lot like Star Trek.
But that doesn't seem such a bad world to me. You know what? Why not? Why do we have to keep fighting over everything? And why can't we just move to a place where, hey, do you fancy a platinum asteroid? We can get you one if you want it. I don't know what you're gonna do with a moon's worth of platinum, but have fun.
Yeah, I mean, this actually seems like a great way to shoot stuff back to us too.
Right, you could.
There's no reason you have to keep stuff shooting out. You could also have it shooting back and just have some sort of deorbiting system.
Yeah, you'd want a real good net though, wouldn't you, for that one? Like, some guarantees would have to be made. But sure, I mean, yeah, it just represents a way of moving large masses around. You know, it's a platform we don't really have. As I say, one really good analog is it's kind of imagine a chemical powered railgun. Like,
yeah, let's talk about railguns.
Ooh, spicy.
Yeah, I know. I think they're interesting for two different reasons. They're interesting because, to me, it's like, why do Spinlaunch when you can do railguns? But also, railguns and Spinlaunch both have one benefit that you don't have, or at least not an easy one, which is that they work with just solar power. I could just kind of just throw this thing around, just keep turning it with solar power, and eventually it throws off. You know, you have to have huge solar power battery banks.
You would need a lot.
This infrastructure would be enormous.
And there's an opportunity cost that comes with that. But yeah, I agree.
Yep. And railguns have a very similar, I don't know if their infrastructure, it has to be as big, but it's certainly big. But because it's just huge banks of capacitors, just throw it off. So how do you guys see yourself compared to railguns?
So I'll start on the energy. There's two pieces, I suppose, that are big differences. One is the energy requirement, and they're a little simpler there if all you want is solar panels. I will say you can get the RAM accelerator to work. You could work it on hydrogen and oxygen, so you'd only need water and electricity as opposed to, and it is one more extra resource.
It's one extra thing.
And if you're around asteroids or you're on the moon, there's a fair bet you've got water, because if you're anywhere near people, you'll have to have water. Water is. Or if you're near rockets as well, you know, rockets aren't electrically powered either. Although I suppose we won't get into plasma thrusters, but anyway, but yeah, it is one extra requirement, and you know, so you might not see it on very remote mining operations or something, but anywhere there's a person or anywhere there's a significant installation, you'd have that. It'd be fine. But I mean, the number one, if I'm being quite blunt, the number one advantage of this technology is that it actually works, right? Like railguns they'll work once. You know, the reason it's called a railgun is because the vehicle, the projectile, the armature, whatever, it has to touch two rails. So you've got something that's in contact with two rails doing hundreds of meters a second, thousands, in fact. It gets hot. It has to rub them. It has to touch them. And they just get real melty. There's a very good reason that the U.S. military recently retired, or sort of canned the railgun program they were running, and it's because that it, they weren't not going to say, are they? But it probably doesn't work as well as they would like. That they have some materials, a bit like fusion, they have some materials problems where they haven't quite figured out how they're going to do it.
One nice thing about it on a battleship, let's say, is that you have nuclear power on the battleship, so theoretically, you could have next to infinite amount of energy to keep firing these railguns, but how much cheaper is it to just siphon off some seawater and turn that into hydrogen and oxygen? And
yeah, I mean, there exists today the technology to do that. That would be very doable. If you happen to be floating on a literal ocean of combined rocket fuel and you have unlimited electricity, then yeah, want to put this on a barge on one of those nice, oil platforms that are sitting out in the middle of the Gulf Sea or something? That would be perfect. All you need is sunshine.
So, that brings me to one of the things I want to talk about, which is the legal implications of trying to actually get one of these things up. And before I'm not going to get to the punchline too early, but I think one of the things that I've been thinking is, why are we even talking about doing this in the United States? Seems like the United States is one of the least friendly places to be doing this from. You could just, as you said, put it out on a barge somewhere.
You could, yes. Although, I mean, I will say the FAA extends its jurisdiction to any American person, regardless of where they are in the United States. Yes. Well, no, I am, because I have a green card.
Sorry.
Yeah, so you have to. Yeah, they don't let you play for free.
Okay, all right.
So that pesky ITAR work, but yeah. So you do have this problem, and there are certainly things that you could do. I mean, anywhere is going to be wary, though, of you launching things to space. More immediately, especially with current circumstances, they're worried you are going to start World War III with unannounced launches of some kind of small vehicle, right?
Going like Mach 5.
Going at incredible velocity,
which
right?
May or may not go off course
on a ballistic trajectory,
some of these things are tests and who knows what they're going to do.
Or just more generally, let's say Elon Musk launches a rocket and it falls down in the middle of London. Well, then what do you do? Like, if it's it's a country, it'd be a major diplomatic incident. But when it's a person, who there is no precedent for that. What do you do when a civilian starts World War III? Right? Like, right now, there are people out there building habitats that look like they would work on the moon, building rockets that would launch them to the moon. I mean, Musk likes tossing cars. Why you could say, well, why not just land a moon base then? That would have been a reasonable demonstrator. And the reason is that if he did that, the US government would want to have a real friendly chat with the man. Because if you put a base on the moon, right, again, like there's not very little precedent for that. Do you own it? Is it yours?
Is it your flag or is it someone else's flag?
or what if I get in my rocket and I land on the moon with a base? So this is mine now. Possession is 9/10 of the law.
That's
right?
Leon's, yeah.
Right. Who's to stop me? Or quite scarily,
there is some international treaties about this, though.
Yeah. But
it's supposed to be neutral because it is the moon.
Right, but not all of them agreed to it. Like, it's not like everyone signed it, right? I mean, if my memory,
I'm going to need you to sign that.
Yeah, right. and if my memory serves me right, I don't think the US and Russia did either. I may be wrong, but like people, you may want bits of the moon. I mean, or what if there's only one piece of it that has any real ice on it, right? And then, the Chinese did a good job mapping water out in the moon. My guess is while we have been romanticizing Mars, but getting straight there is a bit of a fuss, You sort of, the analogy I like is, imagine you live, next to a small river or something, and you've heard of this in England, and you've heard of this great new land across the ocean. So you jump in your rowboat and you row down the river. It's a shallow river. What else can you do? And then you get to the ocean, and now you have to rowboat yourself across the transatlantic ocean, which is going to be a real fuss. That doesn't go well for some people. And because it's this challenge that you have to have a vehicle now, a boat, that will navigate tiny little rivers and enormous great big oceans. Wouldn't it be lovely to have a dry dock? Wouldn't it be better to go to the mouth of the river and build a dry dock to launch a large vehicle from? And there's sort of a saying in orbital mechanics that, getting to orbit is halfway to anywhere. And it's really true if you do the math on the delta V's you need to do that kind of thing, the sort of, or the vehicle you want. And there's the moon, which is made of more or less exactly the same stuff as the Earth. It's already in orbit of the Earth. And also very convenient, it doesn't even have an atmosphere. So there's nothing to even mess with you a bit on the way out. And so my guess for what the Chinese plan is they want to build a moon base, and they're going to use that as sort of a dry dock to the solar system.
As we should.
I know, I agree. And America has changed its posture the same way. It immediately said, okay, we are, for realsies this time, we are going to build a moon base.
Yeah.
Because they don't want the Chinese to show up and land on the only spot of ice and say, this is our rocket fuel now. We own this, What do you do then? That would be an interesting day, I'm sure.
So what are the current hurdles that you're facing from a legal perspective getting stuff up? I mean, one of the things I think you and I talked about offline quite a while ago was just getting things up more than once per day is something that they're just not prepared for. There's no way to do that currently. And what other kind of obstacles are you facing?
Yeah, I mean, and I understand, right? People that legislate don't want these things to get away from them because they're worried that something will go wrong. And it's sort of like, it is not easy, though, to fly one of these things, for fear that you start World War III, or for fear that it simply drops on someone's head, right? You have to go to special places and things like this. So if like this White Sands Missile Range and Spaceport America, we were talking about them about a possible launch campaign coming up, and it's just tricky because.
And currently you're out of White Sands, right?
We've done some stuff out of Spaceport, but they're basically next to each other. But and one, if you're at Spaceport, you're basically playing by White Sands rules because the military doesn't want you to drop a rocket on them, unsurprisingly, right? And so we were chatting with them, and I was like, well, what do I do if I want to launch? And they're like, well, you can notify us about 2 weeks out, and then get you permission, and you can do a launch. And you're like, okay, but what if I'm setting up and I'm ready, and it's 2 hours until the end of the day, I'll just give it a go. Like, well, you have to wait 2 hours, and I'm like, okay, and I'm like, well, sorry, you have to wait 2 weeks, and I'm like, all right, well, it's not great, but okay, I guess we'll have to get better at planning. And I'm like, well, what if I wanna do 20? And they're like, well, we'll give you a window. You can do a few in the window. I was like, okay, well. But what if I push out? Like, what if I have to wait till the afternoon because there's something I want to fix? Well, now you've missed your window and you can't launch. And it's sort of like, I don't know, it's just a wholly other world, right? Where you would get the rocket to be perfect, and then waiting 2 weeks is nothing because you spent 3 months setting it up anyway. So you can afford to just wait until it's perfect. I'm like, I want to fire one of these off, tinker with it, see where it went, fire another one, tinker with it some more. Like, now I can do trial and error. Right, I can try one and see if it works. And I remember I was in a talk with someone. You sort of see this analogization sometimes to Silicon Valley. PR was very innovative, and how do we get Facebook, but for space, and given actually Facebook's maybe not the anyway, but like how do you get this kind of innovative
ads running on
very
rockets?
Rapid, right now God, very rapid like innovation space for rocketry? Why can't we do that as we did with Silicon Valley, and very agile and all these things? And I'm like, well, here's the very straightforward answer. Zuckerberg or whoever are sat in there, this very romantic made up idea of them in their dorm room coding away with some grand vision in their mind, right? Imagine if every time Zuckerberg wrote a line of code, he needed FAA approval, right? Or when Steve Jobs wanted to send an email, again, FAA approval, right? Which is not, it's not horrendously onerous, but it's not a quick process.
One of the things I like about your technology is because it is dual use and you can fire it down or up, it seems like you could actually run a lot of these tests in atmosphere pointing at rock, point it straight down and, oh, did that work? No, what about this one? I mean, you'd end up with a big hole in the ground, but at least to get your tests in.
Yeah, and that's definitely a good chunk of what we've done, and that really allows you to perfect the first piece of any orbital capable vehicle, right? Or if you wanted to do any tunneling, that'd be great too. We've flown one of these, in fact, in a mine. The end of the mine didn't enjoy that very much, but hey ho. And so, but as you sort of hinted at earlier, right? At some point, it has to fly. At some point, it has to fly, and you want to start getting smart. And, this is something that you're starting to see with rockets. They don't just want to go up anymore. Sometimes they want to come back down, or sometimes you want to understand the physics of it. There's a whole piece of application of this where I could start doing hypersonic flights. Want to do a hypersonic component flight test? Cool. I can facilitate that with this technology. I can start to do a very iterative technology path, which is very different from
So you've invented a brand new engine.
I mean, I haven't invented it, but I've certainly commercialized it, right? No more so than Elon Musk invented the rocket, right? That wasn't him at all.
But this thing in front of us here, this isn't one thing. This is an engine. What do you do with an engine? Well, you blow your leaves off your lawn with an engine. You drive your kids. You do all kinds of things with engines.
And this is a problem we have run into a bit as a platform technology company. People don't often see the vision of that, right? It's like, so imagine you invented and held the patents for the jet engine, and you're like, great. So I'm a flight company now. I'm also a power company because a jet, natural gas power plants all run basically on jet engines, right?
Tanks.
Right. Yeah, tank engines, sure. Why not boats, right? They run that. Even some drill bits and things have compressor
I think Jay Leno has a jet engine on his motorcycle.
I mean, right. All of these things, it's an engine. You can do whatever you want with it, right? And the better question to ask is, what do I want to do? Now that I have access to this whole new area that I didn't have access to before, which is repetitive hypersonic flight, ultimately. Right?
So we've talked about the very big. What about the very small? Like how miniaturized can this get?
I don't know. inch wide or something, package it down to less, half inch, quarter inch. At some point, viscosity becomes a bit of a problem, but it's surprisingly dynamic. I mean,
so even as a sort of desktop demonstrator that people could do, I wouldn't call it in their home, but small lab environments, they could you could build these things.
Yeah, I mean, you could build one with a 50 cal, right? That would be, in fact, we did. You could absolutely go all the way down to little tabletop things that literally are only a few meters long.
And how fast those go?
Yeah, alarmingly. I don't know. You might come out of that at like a very high. Well, what? Maybe 1,500 meters a second, something like that. I mean, if you made it longer, you can go even quicker,
sure.
Right? But just something that's fairly small, a meter or two long, surprising velocity. And you might say, well, Leon guns do better than that. You're like, guns do, but then guns don't move this, right? But if you just want to do it as a tabletop, the University of Washington has a 38 millimeter diameter one. It's about, yay big, and they accelerate things through that. And it wants to be a safe kinetic amount, because when your kinetic energy starts going up and up, you start running into problems because there's a lot of energy to stop. Right? If you throw it into the sky, you worry less because it just hits some bit of dirt somewhere, you hope. But
yeah,
you're doing it now in a university environment or at your home. Don't do this at home, God.
Just can't wait for that hate mail.
Yeah, right. Some kid's like, Mom.
It's like that kid who built a nuclear.
Yeah, right.
reactor.
The nuclear Boy Scout, right?
Yeah.
God, don't do this at home. I cannot say that. My lawyers advised me to say that, but no. I mean, yeah, you could build this as a tabletop. The technology, and this is what's really exciting in some sense to me, is the technology is very robust, and it's been there for a long time, and it's sort of interesting to us that it never quite got picked up on. And I don't know. Ironically, it might be the absurdity of the HARP and the SHARP and the Babylon project, where this one guy kind of goes on a literal moonshot building these ridiculous guns. That the idea of firing a bullet to space is sort of absurd. And when you basically tell people you want to do something quite similar, I think they get a little worried. But the concept of a rocket is utterly ridiculous. It's a flamethrower broomstick. Can you imagine before rockets were an everyday occurrence trying to explain this thing? Like, this is an enormous explosion downwards, and if I catch it just right in my bucket, I won't explode, and I'll go up. You're like, get out of here! This is nonsense. No, right?
So we talked a little bit about China earlier. I think one of the things they're doing that is some of my more interesting friends have told me, they have parked some kind of satellite at L2 Lagrange. And for those who don't know what that is, there's a couple of low energy places around any three-body system where you can basically park a vehicle and not spend much energy to be there.
Yeah, it's a stable place. It's a relatively stable. It's a parking spot for a satellite, basically, or some space station, whatever you want.
Right. So you don't have to spend a lot of energy, so you can stay there long periods of time and then do whatever you're going to do, presumably for months or years or whatever. So L2 Lagrange is if you drew a line straight from the center of our planet through the moon, it would be beyond the moon.
On the dark side, yeah.
On the dark side of the moon. So what do you think the Chinese satellite, if you were to say, I'm going to park a satellite right there, what would that satellite do? What do you think? What do you think it's for?
Well, I mean, there's a number of things that depending on how you park it in L2, so you can have like a halo orbit where you're in, because L2 is like an area. It's not like a specific orbit. So you can have like a little halo orbit. You're kind of going around. You can always get like visibility. There are completely civilian reasons to be there, which is you want to look at the dark side of the moon. And the Chinese have launched a number of missions to the moon to look for water and resources and whatever.
So this could be an entirely commercial use case.
I mean, that's what they're claiming. They're saying it's a moon observation. And it is a good place to look at the moon. I mean, we just put a sort of the Western world, if you will, just put a whole new space telescope out there, right? To look out into the cosmos. Because now you can use the moon as a shield. Oh, well, that's a lie. It's Earth L2, but still. There are reasons you would want to be there. One of them, principally, the moon is tidally locked. It doesn't spin, right? Or it does. It spins at a rate that it always looks at us, which is why you always see the man in the moon or the rabbit in the moon or whatever those blobs are to you, right? So you never see the back of it. there's a dark and light side of the moon. So being at L2 with the moon allows you to look back.
So it might be just purely surveillance to understand all the topology of the
sensing equipment, all kinds of things. There are plenty of legitimate reasons to be there. Alternatively, yeah, they might want to do something naughty that L2 makes sense for. And the Chinese government, the Chinese space agency is entirely a military organization, as far as my understanding of it goes. And so, I mean, or whatever they want, everything in between. Could be communications, could be monitoring of what other people are doing. It's a great place to hang out if you want to just keep an eye on other people's stuff. Because the Chinese aren't the only people to have put something in L2.
Sure. So space junk. It's a fun topic. So one of the things that came up on this Ukrainian Russian invasion that's happening right now, that I thought was especially interesting and slightly terrifying is, well, all Putin has to do is just blow up some random thing in orbit, and we have basically no space capabilities for a very, very long time, not because of the electromagnetic, just because of the space junk. All the stuff whipping around in orbit, it would take months to identify it all and figure it out, and we would be ultimately very, very screwed, and ultimately catastrophic downstream effects potentially. And
that would suck, yeah.
But one of the things I like about your technology is it seems like that might actually be not a solution, but might be a great way to quickly go up and capture something and take it back down.
Yes, it would give you a fairly cheap vehicle that you could go up there and grab something with you didn't like, and maybe you're not even necessarily in orbit. You just go up to something that'll actually rendezvous with whatever the object is, snare it in some fashion, and just drag it back down.
And this is why the mobility of your system actually might be extremely important, because launching it from spaceport might not be the perfect, catching point. It might be heading the opposite direction. It might be heading across purposes.
Right. And just generally, right? People don't think about this too much with an airplane. An airplane can take off from an airport and then do 180, go the other way. But the way we're building, a spaceship at the moment is when you or a rocket, right? You build a launch site to launch in a certain direction, be it equatorially or polar or whatever you want to do. And you can't really just turn the rocket around and sort of jump from one to the other. It wastes a lot of fuel. It's not worth it. And so you have to have that modularity. In an airport, you just take off, turn the airplane around, and fly the other way. It's not a problem. But you can't really do that with a spaceport. And so again, if you want to move to a world where you're launching these things in all directions for all kinds of different things, for be it catching space junk or whatever it is, we cannot continue, or what we are currently doing with our infrastructure and with our legislation does not in any way align with the vision of people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and everyone else who says they want to see, in fairness, it's the vision of Blue Origin. It's the vision of SpaceX, right? It's the people in those organizations that are really making that future possible. And their vision as an organization is to see millions of people living and working in space. And how are you going to do that when I can't even launch one rocket without a lawyer and about 6 months worth of paperwork? And of course, as always, no one wants to say yes to this. So if you go to the FAA and you're like, hey, by the way, I want to do something that no one's ever done, their first answer isn't like, that's really cool, let's go. No, it's very easy.
Government
no
workers
administrator,
are very rarely excited by these kinds of things.
No administrator ever got fired for saying no, but you very quickly get fired for saying yes. And so it's just really hard. You're like constantly fighting everything. And it has to be safe and it has to be reasonable, but you're never just going to see that change until, imagine it again, if you wanted to fly a single airplane, I needed to file 6 months worth of paperwork and argue with all these people as to why I was going to fly out the sky and all these things. So we have to choose what we want to do, because the future we say we're trying to move towards looks nothing like the reality of me operating in it today. And I have no doubt people plan to change it, but still, nonetheless, that's where we are.
When I spent some time out at Goddard, and they had a lot of, that's the sensor division of NASA, they have a lot of sensors going up specifically to monitor the sun. There's a lot of effort to understand the sun. First of all, we don't understand it very well, but also it is a very threatening body above us. It could wreak havoc down on us very quickly with a solar flare. And we know that has happened once. Fortunately, we didn't have much infrastructure to destroy at the time. But another thing that I think, one aspect of this that I think, even if we don't start launching 20, 30, 100 of these things a day, I think that we need to have everything ready to go to do it. Because if that one day happens, where the solar flare comes along and it just wipes out everything we have, all the GPS systems, all the satellites, the communication satellites, they all just go away. We're going to need them back up really quickly. And this seems like one path to getting at least a starter network up and running where, okay, we have some GPS, we have some communication path, we have some way to bounce these communications around the planet or whatever. Have you guys talked about that at all with NASA, or like you really need this like really bad? If you're looking at the sun this intently, clearly there's something else going on there. We care about it. Why not focus on solutions as opposed to just detection?
Right. Or yes, because it even if you see the giant solar flare coming, that's not going to do you a lot of help. And I mean, and this happened to SpaceX actually quite recently. They lost a bunch. They lost about 40 Starlink satellites to a flare. That they were just unfortunate when they went out, and it just whooped, and it took pretty much all of them out.
I know that.
Yeah, just what they launched it, and all of that fuss and money, and then some solar flare was just like,
interesting.
Just fried them all. And yeah, it's as you said, it's a very real threat. As far as we can tell, it's happened before, which we assume means it's going to happen again. And you want an ability to replace your infrastructure quickly, and just generally, you want an ability to put in. What if I want a satellite swarm? What if someone attacks me, or something goes horrendously wrong, and some catastrophe destroys every satellite up there? And I think, and you're actually in a better place to understand this than many, maybe, the reliance that we have on things like the GPS signal for things outside of GPS, like global timing, right? How do you know what the time is between devices? How do you synchronize communication? How do you talk to parts of the world where you don't have infrastructure? And also, what happens if, as you're saying, is as you remove ground-based infrastructure in favor of orbital infrastructure, like, why I don't want to lay a cable, it's expensive. Can't I just have internet by satellite? Sure, you can now. That's the thing. Until the satellite stops, and you didn't bother building the infrastructure in the first place because there was no point. And now what? So what do you do now? You can't replace that really quickly. You're kind of screwed.
Right. Which is why I think having 50, 100, 1,000 satellites ready to go at a moment's notice that we could just launch and go, okay, there you go, bam, 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 get them all done in a week or so, or whatever it takes. That seems like a really important thing for NASA to be focused on, to me.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, and it's definitely an idea we've pitched at points. But yeah, if with 5 or 6 launch sites across the entire world, which would not at all be hard to achieve, and enough of these in your back pocket, you could just bang one up every few minutes and just launch a constellation in a matter of days.
But similarly, it seems like you could do something very similar for space satellites that are meant to monitor something outside of our solar system. If you want to have a very large camera pointing out into some event that you're like, oh, there's a black hole about to consume something out there, we need to get a really good photo of it. Yeah, you can do it with the ground-based stuff, but you can also shoot up a constellation of high-res cameras all pointing at the same place at the same time and combine the images, and that might only cost hundreds of thousands or low millions of dollars, which seems almost like a no-brainer. Of course you would do that.
Right, and you can move to this, again, I mean, the kind of capability that you can realize with something like a RAM accelerator can really offer a shift in the paradigm of how you think of satellites. When the rocket costs $100 million, why wouldn't I spend $10 million on the satellite, right? If you wouldn't spend $10,000 on a plane ticket and then only spend $200 on the rest of your holiday or whatever, right? $1,000 on the rest of your holiday. So you have this really expensive rocket, you're going to put a really expensive satellite in it. But to exactly your point, one, because of the failure rate of electronics, it's nice to have a large number of things. So if something freak happens, it only destroys a couple. But two, gestalt sensors. If There was this story where someone realized that in a data center you might have millions of back in the days when they were spinny disk hard drives, right? And every one of those hard drives has an accelerometer in it. The accelerometer is not very good, but it's just there in case you drop it. And a couple of scientists actually convinced one of the data centers to let them patch it so they could pull the accelerometer data out. And they have 10,000 simultaneously reading accelerometers. And the accuracy of all of them reading at once was about as accurate as a very state-of-the-art seismograph. And so the point being that, like you say, you can launch swarms of vehicles up if it becomes cheap, each of them with small sensor payloads, and the aggregate of them really comes together to give you accuracy. So it's a paradigm shift, really, because again, this engine is very enabling. So you could just do things you could never do before.
Space elevators.
Space elevators.
I really like this idea. Obviously, it's a single choke point, so it could easily be destroyed, which is dangerous. There was actually a recent sci-fi show about this. But it does give the ability for us to very rapidly get stuff up. Mm-hmm. I should say not as rapidly as this.
No, I mean, it would be a great piece of civilian infrastructure for sure.
Right. But this, most of the reason I think that that technology is just way too far away, other than the material sciences of it, is just the getting it up there in the first place. But this seems like a way we could actually do that. It seems like you could just attach some very strong cable and get it started.
Yes, you could theoretically, because one of the things you require with a space elevator is a balancing mass, right? So you put something up there that wants to fly out, and then you drop a cable down exactly as you suggest, and then the mass that it's like you're again spinning a bucket of water but off the planet and tethering it with a piece of string. Mm-hmm. And yeah, this again, it would be another way you could just put a very large amount of mass up into orbit at a reasonable cost. Although, I mean, when you're talking about space elevators, I'm not sure about how reasonable we're being, but nonetheless, no. I mean, again, that would be another application where this would work. The trouble with, of course, space elevators at the moment is just the unobtainium that you need to make them. I think someone did the math and they found if you used carbon nanotubes, you might just about get away with it. But theoretically, yes. And it would be, if you could realize that, it would be a completely world-changing piece of infrastructure, of course, because, I mean, one, it only costs you a few $1,000s worth of electricity to go up, and then you can actually regeneratively harvest it on the way back. So the difference is only your friction, which is low. So
yeah, that's great. So I'm going to ask the obvious question I'm sure you get whenever you're talking about this stuff. Why aren't you talking with Elon, or why hasn't he just said, okay, I'm just going to take this off the market and own it? Because it seems so revolutionary to me, and it seems so useful for his own efforts of colonization or just getting stuff into space. Why wouldn't he just heavily invest in your company or take it over, or do the same thing? I mean, why wouldn't he just start violating patents and just do it?
I mean, well, and certainly that's the sort of Musk MO, right? He bought Tesla after all, and then I'm sure that came with an NDA, and the founders can't talk about it. But and maybe he will. I mean, my guess would be that at the moment he doesn't have the same vision of this technology as we do. I mean, if everybody in the world thought about this the way I did, I'd be insanely well funded right now. But not everyone thinks that that's your answer, or that that's their problem. Elon Musk is a process man, it would seem to me. He's very good at coming. He wants to launch more rockets, so he builds a good process to make them cheap. He wants to get electric cars and batteries, so he builds a process to make them cheap. Want a bigger Tesla battery? Cool. Get two of the originals and stick them together. Like that, he just builds one of something, makes it cheap, and scales them out, right? And that's not to knock it.
It's a very Henry Ford way of looking at things.
Indeed, and it's a great approach if you want to bring the cost of something down that's expensive, like a battery. He builds one rocket engine. There was the Falcon, right? The Falcon 9 is 9 of the engines on it. The Falcon Heavy was 3 of the Falcon 9 strapped together. Starship has 47. There's just one engine they built, and they just mass produced them. And it's a good approach, because NASA was trying to always build the world's best rocket, but you have a budget. So what you really want is the world's cheapest rocket, right? A bit more Russian, honestly, in its approach.
Of course.
And it's a good approach. I'm not knocking it, but that's his vision. A man who always seems to want a bigger rocket. Right, and then rockets are his thing, and that's where they're going, and that's his vision of the future. And I'm fine with that. I'm fine for them to have this enormous heavy lifting vehicle.
We're still going to need it, is my opinion. I think we're still going to have it for people, getting human beings out into space. But for everything else, it seems like that might be wildly overly engineered for something that could just be a few $1,000s.
You may even see that, well, as a side piece with the people, you may even see that we go to something like space planes. I mean, there are companies out there like reaction engines, right, who are building these vehicles that realistically sort of more like the Richard Branson kind of Virgin One thing.
Let's talk about that. Yeah, so another way to get into space is fly real high and then rocket for the last couple of kilometers or whatever.
Or you can actually fly to escape velocity in the atmosphere if you can physics the hell out of it. You can do that too.
Really?
But yeah. I mean, if you can fly fast enough, at some point you'll get to escape velocity. Then you just angle up a little bit and zoom out. You don't even need the rocket. But we're not there. That's pretty fast. Yeah, we're not at that one. But yeah, you can. I mean, reaction engines, right? The company that are building the Sabre engine, they have a concept for a vehicle that's just a single engine vehicle, or a single stage to orbit vehicle is what it's called. So nothing comes off, nothing gets dropped. It's basically an airplane, and it takes off and it flies up to some really high speed, faster than most of these vehicles can fly, and then a rocket kicks in for the rest. And now you're in space.
So it is a two-stage. It's just...
Well, no, because they don't drop anything.
I see.
So they have two engines on them, and those engines are both air-breathing when they want to use them for air, and then they close the intake off, and they carry a little bit of oxidizer on them, and then they just inject the oxygen after that.
Seems like a semantic thing to me, but all right. I'll give it to him.
Yeah, why not?
But it's totally recoverable as well.
Yeah, it all goes up together. Because I would say this, you could not fly a rocket to space as a single stage, right? You it is a vehicle that flies on such thin margins that the only way to get there is to throw the bits of it you're not using into the ocean as you go. You have to get, imagine you're in a dragster, right, on a race, and you're revving this engine, it's screaming, you drop the clutch, it takes off, it races along, it races for 30 seconds and then runs out of fuel. And there you are just going at whatever speed you've got, and you've got to get to the top of some hill that's coming, right? And you're too heavy. So what you have to do is you have to stop unbolting bits of the car and tossing them off to the side of the road, dropping the mass of this thing so it will roll up to the top of this hill. That is what a rocket does. You have to throw the spent fuel tanks off as you go, or you would never get there. And that's why they're staged. It would be impossible otherwise.
I want to change the topic a little bit.
Yeah, go for it.
So you are a professor, have been a professor.
A lecturer, yeah.
You teach.
Taught, researched, that whole shebang, yeah.
People who are younger than you learn things from you.
Sure.
Okay.
Unfortunately
I
for
don't
them.
I don't know how to phrase that exactly, but all right, you teach.
Yeah.
One thing that has come up societally here is the difference between objective math and equitable math. And I think a lot of people are just about to tear their hair out. If they're at all listening up to this point and hanging with this conversation, I think most people are going to be very annoyed with this. But I think it's very interesting and important, actually. So if you go to the deepest, darkest parts of Twitter, you're going to find stuff that says, well, 1 + 1 isn't 2. Or they'll come up with some math that isn't math. And there'll be 100 people trying to explain what that means. And usually it's very terrible, and you just kind of look through it. It's like they're like one banana plus 1 orange isn't 2 oranges, and like what? That's not what the math said. So that's a very bad understanding of even what it is. But I think there is actually something there, and it's kind of a little bit complicated. So the Sorites paradoxes, I think, is one way to look at it, which is, let's say you have a big pile of sand, and you call that a pile of sand, and you remove a grain from the pile of sand. Is it a pile of sand? Yes. Well, what if you remove 2 grains of sand and you keep doing that forever? Are you still going to end up with a pile of sand? No, you're going to end up with 1 grain of sand or no sand or whatever. So there's this point at which math turns into something a little bit different, where you kind of have to explain what we're even talking about before you can even start with the math. And for somebody who, and this is me steelmanning this argument as much as I possibly can, because
Steelman away,
because I think this is hard for me to even fully grok, because there's a lot going on here with regard to societal understanding of math. So let's say you have, I'm going to give you a bunch of examples here. So let's say you have 2 solar masses, and both of them are half the mass needed to create a black hole, and you shove them together. Do you have one gigantic sun, or do you have something completely different? You have one black hole. You don't have two suns.
Right.
Or let's say you have some idempotent math, like 0 to the power of whatever, or 0 times 0, anything.
Right. 0 times 5 4 is 0. 0 times 5 is 0. It doesn't matter what you do to 0. It pretty much always comes out 0.
Unless you do NAM.
Right.
And then it turns into NAM. So there's all these examples that I think from a mathematical perspective get really interesting. If I'm going 3/4 the speed of light and I double that, am I going 1 times 5 speed of light? No, I probably tore myself up because no one can go that fast. There's all kinds of things that are between here and there that get more complicated. So back to Earth here, let's say I have some woman who can barely get by on her salary, and she is barely able to afford the cheapest place in her building. And you're like, well, I'm going to cut her salary in half. Does that mean her place is half as good? No, she has no place. Now she's homeless.
Right.
And there's a lot of examples of this that I think if you're not particularly well versed on economics, you can get in real trouble for. Like I made this amount per week. I go to the dollar store, I buy 3 things for my kid because I have $3 left over. And suddenly I go to the dollar store and everything's $1.25. So my $3 weren't worth the same this week as they were last week. I can only buy 2 things for my kid. So, and fuel prices, like I can drive this far and this much fuel, and suddenly I can't do that anymore because the amount of money I put in my car, I put the same amount in every day. I don't know what's going on. Now I can't drive as far.
Right.
So there's this experience about math. This kind of a little bit what you were talking about earlier, where mathematical models are toys, and they're not particularly good toys sometimes. And I think they're in the context without explanation, they're not good toys, or at minimum, they don't take into account all of these hidden variables that one who is describing the math to a child who has some very strange lived experiences are like, I don't know what you're talking about because that just isn't true. When this ends up happening, these other random effects occur. If I'm in a car that can only go 80 miles an hour and I push the accelerator down twice as fast, I'm not going twice as fast. It can only go 80 miles an hour. And there's so many examples in the real world that we run into. Like, how do we bridge that gap? I know as an educator, you have to deal with some pretty complex topics, and these are probably pretty bright kids if they're at your doorstep, right? But how do we, as educators, as people trying to have conversations with people who aren't particularly well educated yet, and kind of bridge that gap? Or what do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think the problem is, math. You build a model, right? So you say to someone, build me a model for something, people and money and households or miles driven and all these things, right? And they will do that. They will look at the bulk of the problem they're trying to solve. They'll build themselves a model, and that model will float out into the universe or into the internet, and people will use it or they won't, right? Mm-hmm. And that model is only as good as the person that built it. It's a tool for you to use. It's like saying, I have a hammer and I take a nail and I can hammer in my nails, of course. And then somebody says, well, this screw looks pretty similar to a nail, so I'm going to get this hammer and in they're going to go. And of course, if you've ever tried to hammer a screw, it doesn't work at all. But if you don't know that, if you don't appreciate the very slight nuances to a problem or to a solution or to a method, how would you know? And there is this problem where you just get told, oh well, just do this, or statistically, what does that mean? Or in economics, I can have 1.5 people, mm-hmm. but in reality, I cannot.
Well, you can. You're just not going to like the results.
You can, but they're not going to buy anything.
It's kind of like this barrel of monkeys thing. Like, you can do that. I wouldn't though.
Or another example. I mean, what does it mean to take the average of something? We used to sometimes joke about this in the lab. The mean is meaningless. Right, so I spend half my time at home and half my time at work, which means if you take the average, I live and work and eat and sleep and wash my clothes all on the highway. Mm-hmm. Right, that's my average location is on the highway, midway between home and work. And that's where I spend all of my time. And then you're there saying, well, how does Leon get any clothes washed on the highway? It doesn't make any sense, right? And so it
rains a lot in Texas.
Right, exactly. It's not I just hang it up and the lorries come by and splash me, right?
No, you have a convertible. What are you talking about?
And so this is you. In order to use the tool, you kind of have to understand the tool. And you know, sort of going back to Bernoulli's. Bernoulli's is a way of thinking about fluid dynamics and the way that a wing works, but that it doesn't give any physical understanding of the problem. No more so than picking up a hammer teaches me how to build a house. Right, I have to know
even
that
how to
first.
hold a hammer.
Right, how not to break my thumb. Tell that to
or hold the wrong end, right? I mean,
right, or not to use screws. There's nothing implicit to a model that explains what its use or anything about it, like or to a tool, right? To a hammer, pick up a hammer without instruction. What are you supposed to do? And I think that gets lost, right? I've seen. I remember once listening to someone, and he said, this is, you know, he said, these are the equations that govern my system. And I said, okay. And he said, and clearly you could see it's a wave. I said, how do I know it's a wave? It was great. He was really Italian. He said, because it is the wave equation. And I'm like, oh, of course. Like, that means it must be a wave. Like, it's as if people will put the math up and they'll say, here, obviously from the math you can see. And I really struggle with this at university. I'm like, I don't see it at all. I don't see why that should mean that a plane flies. It took me a long time to really think it through. I'm like, what does a wing do? It just pushes air down. That's all they ever do.
Or get sucked up when it's
sucked up, and then you fly down. Which, I mean, you could do that. Airplanes fly upside down.
Sure.
It still works. And so, that you really have to have a better understanding for the model of things. And I think this is where science has gotten a bit miscommunicated, perhaps, because every university has a press office. All the big ones do, and the press office are always hungry for content. And the academics, of course, are never very good at producing like well relatable sentences. And so, like for instance, you know, how you can go and Google wine cures cancer, wine causes cancer, and wine prevents cancer.
This is a perfect lead into my next question. Yeah. Okay, so there's this thing right now. A lot of people are saying trust the science.
Mm-hmm.
It's a mantra, and it's not a very good mantra, because what does that even mean? Like, one day Google will say how many planets there are, and it does, and then the next day it doesn't include Pluto. So which is it? Science said one day that Pluto was a planet, the next day it said it wasn't a planet. So which one am I supposed to believe? How do we go from something that's counterfactual to definitely true, and we all now know it to be true, without there being this middle ground where people say, well, I generally believe our current science, however, this new experimental science is something we should keep our eye on. Why are we so binary about what is true and not true, given the fact that we are so often wrong?
Right. And you know, the science is constantly changing. At some point, the world was flat, and at some point, the heavens rotated on spheres, and it's, you know, all these. It's just someone's best idea. And in a decade, it might turn out that, you know, quantum mechanics was entirely wrong and Einstein had the right idea. I mean, who really knows? And I think you just have to be ready for that. We saw a lot of the COVID stuff. You know, it was anyone's best opinion. And literally, it could change overnight. And people, and this is the trouble. Trust the science is a poor way of doing it, right? Like, imagine you were going to buy a house, a fresh build house, right? You know, I mean, and all the millennials are like, in this economy,
yeah,
right? But still, right? But so let's say, in this purely fictional world, yeah, right, in this purely fictional world, I am of course imagining, but you say, I'm touring a fresh build house, and I'm with my realtor, the person touring me around, and they show up and they say, they say this, and you've got it's a great build of a house. Trust the hammer, you know. Trust the drill. We used nothing but the finest hammers to construct this house, and that would seem really strange. Like, what do you mean trust the hammers, right? Whereas if I walked into, they said, hey, don't worry, but you can really trust the builders. You can trust these are good builders, but they build solid homes. You're like, okay, I can say I could trust a builder. The hammer's sort of irrelevant, really. Maybe they had bad hammers. Maybe it's just Steve with a brick. It doesn't matter. If the builder is trustworthy, it's fine, because it's the builder that uses the tool. And again, science or these mathematical models, it is just a tool. So saying trust the science is like saying trust the hammer. Really, what you should be saying is trust the scientist. Right? I trust the scientist that that did this, that they understood the tools they were using and they came to an unbiased conclusion. Because you can just lie. Scientists aren't magic. They're people too. There's a lot of egos in science. They can just lie.
And also a lot of conflicts of interest. They're paid often by grants from people who have a vested interest in making certain outcomes happen.
Yeah, sure. I mean, everyone's paid by someone. Everyone has a vested interest.
And that is precisely why I think it's wise to question everybody until we have good answers.
I think you're never going to have good certain answers.
No. Well, I think sometimes we will. I think sometimes there are airplanes flying, and we're like, well, it clearly worked.
I mean, there are some.
I mean, if we're seeing positive outcomes, then obviously this model at least is workable. It may not be accurate. We may not know why the Earth is doing the thing it's doing, but hey, we can still navigate. We can still, send satellites up. We can still use GPS. Our model about where the sun is or the Earth is or how the exact size of it might be off by a couple meters here and there. But, as a model, it's close. If someone comes to me and say, no, we were wrong. The Earth is really like 3 meters wider than we thought it was. Okay,
Right. And that is a piece of perhaps the scientific process that gets a little overlooked on these Twitter arguments, or when it suddenly really matters whether something is right or wrong, and you suddenly care about what a bunch of people are nuancedly arguing about, right? Is the scientific process. Yes, there's this bit where you publish papers and you will argue over who's right, and you go to conferences and blah, but there's actually this big, long, then process that is rather unsatisfyingly decades long, where you see how these things play out. Mm-hmm. And where are my proof points? We're doing experiments today that are showing that things that Einstein came up with, half a century ago might actually be right. And, all this gravity wave stuff and everything else, things that were predicted mathematically or guessed at really mathematically decades ago and only now bearing fruit. The sort of disappointing piece about some of these things is sometimes you have to make your best guess and move forward. You can't always have well-bounded kind problems, right? Where you get accurate immediate feedback. I think this is my equation, so I use it and it predicts it well and the answer falls out. Sometimes you have really chaotic systems where it's really hard to know. You might say, Leon, here's $10,000, spend it in the US economy to make inflation go down. Find a way to spend $10,000 that combats inflation. So I go out and I guess and I try it, and who knows what inflation's going to do? Because one, $10,000 is not a lot of money, and two, that whole system's so chaotic anyway, it probably doesn't matter. And so
that's a lot of problem. I have problems with a lot of the microscopic experiments. It's like, well, how many variables did you eliminate? Well, we put it inside of a chamber. Did you look at it? Because that's light bouncing off of it. Were you talking in the room? Because it's sound waves bouncing off of the glass.
Right, sure.
And, there's a lot of variables that are not accounted for. Even in the most well-meaning experiments, you can just tell these are not done by people who are really trying to narrow down on the hard part of the science, which is getting rid of anything that might make their environment or their experiment even slightly invalid.
Well, and I would reframe that as saying it's impossible to remove doubt from any experiment completely. And your options then are either waiting a really long time to see if you can find a reason that it's wrong, right? That's reducing doubt in that way. Or it's about...
But you can certainly reduce doubt. There are certain ways...
You can.
There's certain ways you can narrow down on...
But some things...
The variables here are numerous, but they're accounted for. These are the things that might be wrong about my thesis. I don't know if they're wrong. I have no reason to believe they're wrong, but if anyone wants to try to narrow this down and repeat this experiment, here's the areas that I would focus on to try to narrow down and make sure that I'm right.
Sure, and the scientific literature goes out, publish or perish, right? And so you get to put your dirty laundry out there for the world, and that's that piece that takes a decade. If somebody says, oh, maybe there's some merit in that, I'm going to try and repeat it. And it does work, or it doesn't work, or they get a different answer. And and that's a whole problem really with the entire, I don't know if I'd call it the scientific method, but certainly the scientific world, is that it's really hard to publish experiments that have been done before, but there are an increasing number of studies that would show when you repeat somebody else's experiment, you don't get their answer. And so,
yes.
And that's a piece that, people don't really want to talk about, because honestly, it's also expensive to repeat experiments.
It's expensive, but the fact that a lot of these are not repeatable, it's more than 50%, I think. I forget the real number, but
depends what it's for, but for the biomed stuff, yeah, it can get pretty crazy, which again, they're these large multivariable problems that are really hard to isolate stuff.
Of course, and people walking around and sneezing and coughing and eating whatever they're not supposed to be eating and
and
doing
you're
drugs
also
and
paying that PhD student to do this experiment, and the rate at which they graduate is highly dependent on the success of the experiments they do.
That's
and
right.
Suddenly, like you are motivated to find something.
Right. So I think trusting the science in this context, I think, as you said, it really needs to come down to with the reputation of the
Trust the
individual.
scientist. Don't trust the science. Trust the scientist.
Right.
Decide if you like an individual or a person. And
Or perhaps trust the method in which an experiment was done if you can verify that it was done in that way. But beyond that, stay skeptical if there's competing evidence.
Sure. I mean, sure. Or just, you can even just say, I don't really feel that feels right. That just doesn't sit well with me if you want. But you can't, when you have nothing to, when you can say, oh, well, I don't really trust that. Or I think there are problems with it. That's fine. Go do an experiment that proves it wrong. Then that would be the
like this.
counterpoint.
A good example of this was the gravity drive or the EM drive.
Oh
or whatever.
the wiggly microwave, right?
I mean, there was a lot of people who really wanted that to work, and so NASA said, "Fine, let's come in and test it." And then they found out it doesn't work, and great, now we can move on.
The last I had seen, any of the ground-based experiments seemed to suggest that it did work, but I don't know if they ever launched it.
I thought it didn't work, but they figured out why. But whatever.
But either way,
the point is the same.
It would be an interesting.
Let's put it this way: I've heard no one talk about it in the last couple of years.
Which either means it didn't work, or it went entirely black.
I'm pretty sure it didn't work. But all right. So what I think I'm going to want to round this out with is one thing we've talked about before is space is, I think it's always been interesting to the people who are interested in it, but there's a lot of people who just aren't captivated by it for whatever reason. I think Elon launching a car into space was pretty interesting. I think that I think this is the kind of what is the stupid thing you'd want to do if you just had a bunch of money and a bunch of rockets. Well, you might launch a car into space. That's kind of interesting, stupid, and you could do it. And it's funny. It also is great for branding and all these other things. Right. And he needed to send up a mass anyway, so why not send up something that's at least promotional?
Sure.
What do you say about the next generation and getting them excited? What does it take to really ramp up the excitement? Like there's Mars World that's coming out that'll be like a Hollywood destination. And I think it's actually in the desert somewhere, or maybe it's Las Vegas or something. But there'll be this, 5-star restaurant,
simulated experience thing.
Yeah, kind of similar to Star Wars World or whatever in Disneyland, or Disney World rather. I think those things are interesting, but I don't know that does what you're talking about. Like how do we get people excited about space? If you were the marketer of space and you had to get out there and run some SEO campaigns to get people excited about space, get some clickbait going, what would you do?
I think for me, this was a conversation I would have with sometimes when I was lecturing, sort of giving rocketry 101. And I'd like to ask my students, why are you in my class, right? Because at the end of the day, it's just an engineering class. Engineering is a tool. There is a book that tells you how to build rockets. There's a book that tells you how to build washing machines. And the engineering difference between those two is basically zero. The physics and the actual equations and everything, but that systems engineering approach is identical. So I'm like, why are you in my class learning about rockets? Why aren't you in the washing machine class, which we don't have because no one cares? Sorry, washing machine engineers. And the answer we'd sort of normally get to was that they were there because, a rocket is a literal vehicle, sure, but it is also a figurative vehicle to the future. It is something that says, like, this is a way in which I see the future of humanity. Because if we stay on this planet, right, if we don't opt to get off and go explore and look around, I know how humanity's story ends. It's guaranteed, right? In about 6 billion years or something, the sun will explode and destroy the planet. And sure, a lot can happen in 6 billion years, but that really is sort of a galactic nothing. But if we leave, the story's uncertain. I don't know what will happen. And for me, that's a much more compelling story, right? Is one where we know how these things, we know that there's a future for humanity. We know that we can go out there. And as I said, I myself probably watched a bit too much Star Trek as a kid, right? Like I see this thriving.
So it's Hollywood. Hollywood is how we get there.
I mean, yeah, it's true, right? Look at a cell phone, right? The people that built cell phones watched, people with imaginary little talkie boxes they could talk into. Adults build the technology that they saw imagined as children. And even today, you see that with the things that are coming out, flying cars and all this and robots and Iron Man suits, literally, people don't realize this, how linked art and technology is. People build the things that they imagine, that they found, and you've got these children that saw these technology and were wowed by it, right? And then as adults were consumed by that vision, and they were like, I will make this a reality. And, as someone who is an entrepreneur, I'm sure you understand, more than anything, if you want to realize something, you just have to will it, right? You have to want it so bad that you will make it real. Most people give up. And so these childish fantasies, you have to inspire these children in this idea of a better world that is almost limitless in resource, where everyone can live a comfortable life and we can go and explore a boundless frontier that has endless miracles and fascinating, beautiful things contained within it, and go out into the world as opposed to just staying on our small little space. When, at least personally for me, when somebody says, Leon, why should I explore space? I'm like, well, why should you leave your living room? Why do you go on holiday to different places? Like, why bother? Couldn't you just live in your living room forever, ordering in pizza?
I think there's another aspect of it, which is if your place is going to get hit by a gigantic meteor, you might want to leave, Well,
and there is that as well.
There's the repopulating the species after this.
But that comes back to my
gone.
point. Even if we don't get destroyed by some cataclysmic, even if there isn't a meteor, there isn't another pandemic that kills everyone, there isn't nuclear war, there isn't one of all these many things that could very conceivably destroy the entire human race in a single go, in 6 billion years the sun explodes. It's guaranteed. We know the world will end. It's guaranteed.
It's hard to get budget for something that's going to happen 6 billion years.
Yeah, I know, man. Those politicians, tiny little cycles.
Yeah, but I think that those other catastrophic things, those might get people's brains
and
going.
that could be why it has to happen. You might say that's what has to happen now. Right,
because we don't know. I mean, it might happen. It's definitely going to happen 6 billion years, but it might happen way, way sooner than that.
That could happen tomorrow,
right?
Quite frankly,
I mean, the way things are going, right?
Yeah, Jesus.
So I think you and I are probably similar in the fact that we both believe Mars is the next step. We have to get there. Moon and then the Mars. We have to get to Mars, just for some stability, to get people off this rock in case the bad thing happens.
And I mean, in a stable human population that could conceivably, has enough genetic diversity within it not to basically die out, is probably 20,000 people.
And they're going to have all kinds of issues transporting people back and forth with regard to new viruses. And can you imagine saying, okay, well, some of the people we're sending up might have something like SARS-CoV-2. Are you cool if we land?
Right. Or you might even end up in the situation where, you imagine you go to Mars, right? There's a Mars colony, an Earth colony. Completely separate types of viruses are going to evolve there.
Yep.
In unison with the people that live there. So what was the common cold for the Earth person might completely devastate a Martian colony, and vice versa, right? You end up diverging entirely in terms of what viruses and pathogens you have
which means
community.
We need a very fast pipeline between the two, constant, just to keep the viral pathogens similar enough so that people are... It sounds a little weird, but you want both species to have the same viruses. Otherwise,
no, you kind of do. You want them to be constantly trading stuff so that you don't diverge as a colony. And how you do that, the logistics of that. I mean, you already have people.
MarsDating.com.
Mars dating. That's a delay.
Like to be ahead of the curve.
If you thought the old-fashioned internet was slow,
a couple months, you get to meet the girl of your dreams. So, Leon, I want to thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And to our other special guest
to
here.
our silent partner.
Have we named this partner yet?
Mr. Pointy, maybe?
Mr.
I don't know.
Pointy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's got a little dent at the top there.
Thank you, FedEx.
We can send this stuff into space, but we can't get it across the country.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. It was fit for flight to space, but not sadly for FedEx.
Well, Leon, thank you very much. Appreciate
Pleasure,
it.
sir. Thank you.
Yeah.